one of the concepts that's fundamental to our society, to American federalism, is this notion of separation of powers, right? Who wants to tell us what separation of powers is? This is like 10th grade, but we should start off with it. Separation of powers. Anyone? Mr. Rosario.
Well, we got 3 branches of government, and one is made up by a bunch of representatives that were put there by the people. And the first article of the Constitution allows them to make the laws, but does not allow them to implement the laws. They hand it over to the executive branch, which is the president, so we elect to implement a lot of the laws, and then we get the judiciary branch that can react to any kind of problems or issues that arise in the implementation or the passing of, or the execution of what's outlined in the Constitution.
Everyone follow that? That's all pretty accurate. I think you can sum it up in just a little quicker and just say the powers and duties and responsibilities that are assigned to these 3 branches make sure that no one branch has all the power, right? Divided power. Checks and balances. This is embedded in the Constitution. It's part of our system. It is by design. We all are familiar with this. Congress writes the laws, passes the laws, President signs the laws, and then the executive branch can enforce the laws. Congress declares war, President is the commander-in-chief. Supreme Court reviews laws, federal courts review the laws. They don't create the laws. I mean, everyone understands this general notion of what each branch does. What's interesting is that while this is by design, it's very intentional. The founders wanted it that way because they were just coming off of a system where only one person had the power, the king. What the king said was the law, and we didn't want that, so we're going to make sure that no one person has all the power. That's by design in the Constitution. But those founders could not have envisioned today the type of policy world that we live in. What's interesting is there's also a separation of powers in the policy process. It's probably not something that the founders could have ever envisioned. So it's almost by accident. By design in Constitution, let's say by fate. Accident sounds too naive. By fate in the policy process. And by this I mean, not every player in our political system, both in government and outside of government, has an equal strength or weakness in the policy process. Everyone plays a different role. They're often very similar to this idea of competing powers in the Constitution. Just like that, in the policy process, we have competing powers, strengths, weaknesses that always ensure a lot of conflict and difficulty and strife and challenge. So in a way, it's evolved, I think, from our original founding document. Our policy process is very sort of replete with similar features, which means nothing's easy, no one has all the power, and everybody in the system has a different strength that they can exert in the process. But let's start off by going through the list that Kingdon gave us, because Kingdon looks at these folks one at a time. Mr. Rosario mentioned Article 1. Article 1 is what? Congress, right? The Congress. What does Kingdon start out with? Not the Congress. The Congress. Congress-schmongers, right?
The president.
The president, the executive. Specifically, the president. Kingdon says the president is what? The key decision, or excuse me, the key agenda setter. Because the president has certain institutional strengths that are unique to that body that enable the president to have that power? What are some of those unique characteristics?
Well, he can leverage the power of the veto.
The veto is a great power, a great example of that.
He appoints a whole slew of people.
So let's start off by looking at institutional resources, which include the veto, hiring and firing of cabinet secretaries, institutional resources. One more important thing, it's not just related to the powers, but there's something really unique about the president when you compare it to someone else, to other bodies.
He gets a lot of publicity.
Publicity, why? Why do you think that's the case? What's unique about the president as compared to, say, a member of Congress? How are they different?
They're the only one that's elected.
Only one! There's only one president. There's only one. And as was mentioned, publicity that can be generated through what's called the bully pulpit, right? We've all heard of this. The president has the ability to harness attention to an issue like no other individual in the policy process. When the president speaks, people listen. Even unpopular presidents can get FaceTime before a national audience. Now, who knows who's actually watching or listening, but their ability to do that is unique. When's the last time any of you watched a U.S. senator call a press conference that was broadcast internationally? Never. Doesn't. Oh, you saw one. Wait, what?
Wasn't that one guy, he was just on the news and he was crying because he did something bad?
That wasn't a press conference he wanted to call. You're talking about
It was a
Wiener?
press conference, yeah.
Okay. Not driving a real agenda. I get your point. Certain scandals and events can get you in the news, no matter who you are. But to drive an agenda. So you got it's like you got me. That's good. But yeah, so the bully pulpit. There's only one of them. The veto power, institutional resources. That's where it's at. So to Kingdon, this is like the first and greatest power. If agenda setting is what matters to you, if that's the most important step in this process, the president's the most important person in our system. What's different about that is this is in conflict in a sense with the founders, because Article 1 is sort of first among equals is the Congress. Because the Congress, they represent the people. So maybe we're already seeing a bit of divergence between Kingdon's approach and our sort of constitutional approach. But the president has some other resources. The president has staff, political appointees, like cabinet secretaries. Actually, there's over, I think, 3,000 plus political appointees. Not just the bigwigs that we all know, like the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Homeland Security, Labor, Education, etc., but other people within those agencies that help drive policy and set agendas in those agencies. What's the next group that Kingdon considers? Not even Congress, guys. Are you serious? Who's important?
Is that just staff?
That's right, the staff. We mentioned all that. I mean, even like a bigger, almost a separate category. Not the executive branch. The bureaucracy. The civil servants. I want to talk to Kingdon someday and just go, you are just really sticking in the eye of Congress here. You don't even want to, usually when you address something in a paper, you start from the prominence and you kind of work your way down, right? So maybe he didn't mean it that way. Maybe he could shuffle these around. But civil servants are the next group that he talks about. And where are they on the pecking order with respect to agenda setting? Do civil servants drive agendas? No, why?
They implement.
They're implementers. So here's like the little nuggets to take away. The president, the executive branch, his strength is agenda setting. Civil servants is implementation. Do you see what's happening here? We're getting a little bit of dispersion of power among these different boxes. That's kind of cool to see, right? Just as one branch doesn't have all the power and authority in our Constitution, one branch doesn't have all the power or authority in the policy process. What advantages do civil servants have, though? As implementers, that's absolutely true. There's a great quote in the text. Does anyone here work for the government as a civil servant? Are you guys do you ever fear that you'll lose your job for political purposes? If the president, if in 2012 a Republican administration comes in, does that affect your life in some way? Probably, but your job? No, because you are, here's the quote, presidents come and go, the bureaucracy endures. You're burrowed in a sense. You're there for life. So you just ride it out. Presidents have a limited opportunity. They can only be there for 8 years. So there's a fixed window where they can actually get things done. So that's a bit of a disadvantage for them. Civil servants can be there for life. They have longevity. And civil servants can also develop expertise. Typically, you spend your whole career focused in a very narrow area, and so you might have more knowledge and intimate understanding of that policy than someone who's only there for a shorter period of time. Okay, finally we get to Congress. So president, big agenda setter. Civil servants, big implementers. What do we think of Congress? Anytime you hear Congress, I want you to think of this for the rest of your life. I hope that I taint your life forever. I don't mean that. Here's what you need to think about when you think of Congress.
And right here is my great-grandfather. He's the first cat herder in our family.
Herding cats. Don't let anybody tell you it's easy. Anybody can herd cattle. Holding together 10,000 half-wild short hairs, well, that's another thing altogether.
Being a cat herder is probably about the toughest thing I think I've ever done.
I got this one this morning, right here, and if you look at his face, it's just ripped to shreds, you know?
You see the movies, you hear the stories, I'm living a dream. Not everyone can do what we do.
I wouldn't do nothing else.
It ain't an easy job, but when you bring a herd into town and you ain't lost a one of them, ain't a feeling like it in the world.
They should put Congress right after that sentence, right? What am I talking about? When I'm talking about, I want you guys to think about Congress as being a herd of cats. What's the analogy here? What are we talking about? What's that? It's impossible, but what is it that makes it impossible? Notice it's herding cats with a plural. If it was herding one cat, the president is one cat. The president is one individual. How many members of Congress are there? 435 members of the House, 100 senators, 535 combined. 535 individual, unique policymakers, each with their own agenda, their own desires, their own aspirations, their own motivations. views, beliefs, perspectives, priorities. So we're talking about, remember this issue of diversity? Congress is the epitome of that. And that's a great thing on some levels, but what is it not great for? If you have a lot of people, it's agendas, right? You can't set agendas unless you can get a whole bunch of people to agree with you. And it's called collective action problem. The president is a unitary office, it's one individual. Congress is a whole bunch of people. In order to drive an agenda, you have to gather and collect. You can't just sit, like again, a senator can't just go out and call a press conference and affect change that way. You need to actually gather and collect and harness others and get them to agree that this is a priority of theirs and they share it. And we're going to have to work together to get this legislation through. It's immensely challenging to drive an agenda, to get items on the agenda, for Congress to do that. What they're really good at, although I agree with your instincts are right in terms of, well, it's hard for them to make decisions. It's hard for them to make decisions, but what they're good at is, and this is a nuance that Kingdon stakes out, is they're great at providing alternatives to agendas, which in a sense, I think is decision making. Here's why. The president, and here's a great illustration of it. Did anyone watch the president's address to the joint Congress? How many times did the president say Congress must act now to create jobs? It was parodied on, Jon Stewart and other shows, because it's true. The president wants action. Congress, do something, act now, pass my bill. Here's the solution. Here's the agenda. I'm setting it. Knock it out of the park. Pass the bill, like 20, 30 times. What's Congress done? Oh, we're gonna kick back. We're gonna think about it. We're gonna have some alternatives. We're gonna develop other proposals. Maybe we'll pick off a piece of it that we like here and there. We'll add our own thing. We have to build coalitions. But really, Congress's strength then is in decision making, because the president can raise something on the agenda, but ultimately Congress is the group that has to pass the bill. Congress is the group that has to make a decision to act or not. And that's, as you said, a very complicated process, but that's where their true strength is, because they drive the decision making. The leaders of each chamber get to set what's on the agenda of that chamber and sort of decide what votes are going to get called up, the order, the amendment rules, the time for debate, all those things. They're really, I think, a strength of decision making. So here we're seeing a continuation of this idea that each branch has different strengths and weaknesses. So congressmen are really bad at setting agendas, but they're good at coming up with alternatives. So the president's proposed some sort of bill that has all sorts of provisions in it. Some congressmen might say, well, I like this provision, but I'm going to come up with a different version that's built off that idea. So the president set the agenda. The idea is we need to act so we can create jobs. The president has his proposal. He would like to actually achieve it, but Congress is reacting and providing other ways to do that. And ultimately, they're going to be the ones that pass the bill or not. They're making the decision. President does get some say in that. President gets to sign the bill when it comes passed, or veto it. That's an important decision-making power. So in a sense, this is something I wanted to mention when you raised it, Mr. Littlejohn. That's the veto power is a reactive power that happens after Congress has made a decision. I don't think it's so much an agenda-setting device. The president can't veto a bill that hasn't been passed. The president can't veto non-existing legislation. I would say a veto threat. How about this? We're gonna go a nuance here. Veto threats can drive agendas. If the president says, as he said recently, I will veto any bill that Congress passes that doesn't have tax reform and that raises taxes on the wealthy. I think it was a nuance. It was something where it attempts to reform entitlements without asking for more from those who have the most among our society. I will veto that. That's an agenda-setting threat, because what he's essentially saying is, if you guys pass that bill, you shouldn't even consider it, because it was not going to get anywhere. The actual act of vetoing, I think, is a decision-making power that the president has. That's more of a formal decision that's made after the agenda has been set and the bill's passed. All right, we're going to move right along here. Because Congress has a bunch of different players, and Kingdon gets into them. Staff, chambers, party leadership, committees. But again, we can see this kind of divergence of power. Everyone pretty clear, comfortable with this? Starting to make sense. Let's move on to outside government. These were actors and institutions inside government. Let's look at outside government. Kingdon talks about these folks. Who does Kingdon talk about first? Evil group. The most evil, vile interest groups. They're so dirty. This dirty word. Interest groups. What are interest groups? There are a lot of them, and he defines and goes through them. But we all know of them, right? We know interest groups as business and industry organizations that lobby Congress. Lobbyist is a sort of dirty word, but that's one fair description. Professional organizations, societies, labor groups, public interest groups. Not special interest groups, public interest groups. Does anyone want to tell me what the difference between a public interest and a special interest is? Have I told you guys that yet? It's really important.
Isn't it the special interest groups has an economic stake?
That's one thing. That's one way to think about it. I think that's probably how it's presented in the text. I have a better idea. Does anyone else have a good one? A public interest is something you're for. A special interest is something you're against. That's being a little, you guys are supposed to laugh. That's a joke. I pick popular ones. I don't by any means try to convey any political ideas on you. So when I pick groups, I just do it because it's stuff we're all familiar with. So let's take the NRA, National Rifle Association, the Riflemen's Association, whatever it stands for. Special interest or public interest? Well, if you ask the NRA, what would they say? The right to bear. This is a right in the Second Amendment in our Constitution that all Americans should have, and we need to protect that. That's the public interest. That's not a special interest. Well, what would someone say, like gun owners or gun control, the Brady campaign? Oh, wait a second, you're only looking out for gun owners and gun salesmen and gun manufacturers, and you're causing all sorts of other problems because there's externalities. You're a special interest. You're dirty. You're evil. So who's right? This is where it gets. I don't know that it can be defined truly by just economic interests versus non-economic virtuous interest. I think it depends on the perspective of the interest and your personal perspective as well. And we don't need to go. We don't need to go into dipping our toe into the abortion debate, but that's another great example. So, like Emily's List or other groups that are funding members who have pledged that they will support a women's right to choose. Well, that's the public interest. They're upholding constitutional rights that have been sort of interpreted by the courts and privacy issues, women's right to choose, versus say the Right to Life Committee. They wouldn't say that that's a public interest at all. So again, I think it's much more about the perspective. What is public, what is special, probably depends on the shoes you're in.
I was gonna say, I think I remember the book describing it well as they're more blocking than promoting.
That's absolutely right. That's the key thing we need to remember from here. So our interest groups, remember, we're thinking about it with respect to these steps. Our interest groups, really strong agenda setters, sometimes, but not typically. They're much more effective at blocking agendas, preventing members of Congress through coalition building from bringing items up in committee, pressuring presidents so that they'll act or not act a certain way. They exert influence, but it's not so much in setting an agenda, it's about blocking an agenda or blocking a decision from being made. So they're blockers. That's an important strength. It's a very important strength to have. The next one is a fun one because that's us, or at least sort of me. Academics, think tanks. There's a pretty big distinction sometimes, you know. Nonprofits, policy shops, there are like hundreds of them in the DC area. Academics are great at coming up with ideas for policymakers. So I think that the academics and think tanks' strength isn't in setting agendas so much. It's providing alternatives. It's providing and arming policymakers with ideas to act on. So they may be more involved in the feedback process, providing ideas to the agenda setting and decision-making process. Uh-oh. Now here's the big one. You could do a whole class on this. The influence and effect and power of the media in the public policy process. What does Kingdon suggest? Because I think it's counterintuitive.
He actually suggests that the media isn't as powerful in setting an agenda than you would think they are. They think that he says that they're a little bit more reactive and they talk about things that are already being talked about and set by the government or by the agenda setters.
Yeah, that's right. It's this idea that, hey, we have this perception, there's this notion that the media can control everything. The media controls politics. The left-wing media, the right-wing media, the liberal bias media, they are driving this political world and this whole process. That's, I think, sort of a conventional wisdom. Maybe there's reason to believe that. But Kingdon's studies, again, 1984, it's a while ago, but he doesn't find that. He thinks that their attention span is really short. They're not able to take an issue and really drive it for an extensive period of time because there's competition to always find the next sensational news event. But that if something is on the agenda and they focus on it like a laser, they can help sort of drive it and build it. But they can't bring it to the agenda, but they can help keep it there. What's interesting though, what's changed since 1984, right? A lot. The world is just a different world. Was anyone alive in 1984 that can remember it? I mean, I think when I was a kid, we had 2 or 3 TV channels. Dan Rather, someone else. I mean, it's like, you know, you're getting your news from one place. It was a much different world. Then cable television comes along, satellite television, satellite radio, the internet, blogs. I mean, is blogging even media? Is it news? Yeah. I mean, it falls in that wide umbrella. What we've seen that didn't exist in 1984 is an immense diversity of media outlets. Certainly with blogs and internet. And this is an interesting question. Remember, one of the things that's essential to driving an agenda is having sort of a unified voice or opinion. Well, the more diverse and distributed the ideas in the media world are becoming, the more challenging it is for the media as a whole, if you think of everything in the media, to really drive. It's almost impossible. Because does one network suddenly have more power than another over public opinion? There's an interesting, and there's lots of research on this. I haven't done any myself, but it's very fascinating. Because typically we think of this diversity of ideas and diversity and diversification of media as a good thing. I think people think it's healthy, right? What do you guys think? Do you have any reactions? Where do you guys get your news?
I was gonna say, it's just one-sided, that's the one thing I don't like about it, the diversity, I think. Like, you tend to get one side unless you know where to look. Or if you like something, or if you're more appealed to a certain, station or, anchor, you might get one-sided news.
There's a big difference between like news and opinion, and the lines are getting increasingly blurred in that. And the more diverse outlets that you have, the more people are able to find, like a salad bar, the types of vegetables they like, and then they can avoid the ones they don't. And so you have this interesting dynamic where people go to those news outlets where they hear what they want to hear, or read what they want to read. And that reinforces your views. It doesn't challenge you, doesn't make you think differently or have to like debate or argue. It just reinforces and assures you that, oh yes, I'm correct. It makes you more confident because a certain pundit or outlet is constantly reinforcing your pre-existing worldview. That can be an unhealthy thing, possibly. You go ahead and talk, and then I'll have a concluding thought on that.
Oh, I was just kind of thinking that the difference, or one of the biggest differences between 1984's media and today's media is kind of, in 1984, it's just the media talking to you, but now you can sort of talk back to the media, and it's like very interactive now, and so people can sort of get together, and there's like a sort of a communication aspect to it now.
It's a lot different. There's no gatekeeper, or it's much lower than it used to be, the burdens to getting information, or becoming your own news maker, a news source, YouTube, iReport. I mean, you look at stuff like the Twitter revolution in Iran, where the most accurate news you're getting is from people on the street, tweeting and blogging about it, because other news outlets are being censored by by the government. I mean, it's pretty fascinating. One thing I just want to recommend, and this is for like the rest of your life, not just this semester, don't just listen to one news source. Try to challenge yourself. You have to really do this. If you don't actively try, it's easy to sink back and not do it. I think it's actually it takes an effort to listen and tune in to a diverse range of news. You might love Fox News, you might love Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity, and so you tune in there every night, and that's fine. Or you like Chris Matthews or Keith Olbermann. Whatever it is, I think it's the challenge upon us is to not just go to one person always to hear the same thing that we agree with. It's good to get a diversity of opinions. It may not change your views. It may have an effective strengthening your views because you'll be more confident, able to debate or counteract the differing opinion, but that's important. Because anytime you don't challenge yourself or assume you know the answers without question, then that could be a dangerous place. So that's my takeaway from the media. But yeah, they don't drive agendas so much anymore. They're much more about maybe maintaining agendas if they can report on them to the extent public opinion drives that or is interested in hearing about it. And I guess the interesting question is, what is the relevance of Kingdon's chapter or paragraphs on media in today's world? Because it seems like it's a lot different. Maybe he needs to rewrite that. Maybe we could send him an email, tell him to get off his retirement and get back to action. Let's do a couple more groups here. Elections-related events, they can drive agendas. There's nothing more obvious to prove this or demonstrate this that elections can drive agendas than the 2008 election. McCain, Obama wins, and one of the major policies he advances is healthcare reform, something he talked about ad nauseum during the campaign. There was no surprise. The world was not shocked when Obama advanced healthcare. It may not have unfolded the way he wanted or the way people expected, but that was clearly on his election promise, healthcare reform. So I submit, if John McCain had won the presidency, I don't think the Congress would have spent a year attempting to reform our healthcare system. There would have been other things that he would have achieved. Maybe he would have made some other minor reforms, but that wasn't something that was like front and center on his election agenda. So what I'm trying to suggest is an election agenda can drive a policy agenda. If the person wins, then they have a promise or even a mandate. That term's often used. But sometimes people misinterpret or misunderstand as mandates. So George Bush won re-election in 2004, and the first thing he tried to do was reform Social Security. How successful was that? Not very. There were many other reasons for that too. There were other competing agenda items. Namely, Iraq war was not going into a direction that was very positive. There was a lot of reporting on that. And that kind of prevented that Social Security policy from getting advanced. So people can misread elections and think, oh, I have a mandate. I've been elected, therefore I can achieve my policy. Not always the case. But certainly elections can drive agendas. Within elections, not just candidates and their promises, but sometimes interesting things like third-party candidates, Ralph Nader, or others that kind of elevate certain issues. Not always that they get acted upon, but that they become maybe a little more prominent in the public conscience and to some extent political conscience. Within parties, sometimes in a primary, you can get interesting dynamics, like Steve Forbes in the mid-90s was a one policy is his big thing, the flat tax reform. Raised that, not quite making the agenda, didn't win the primary, Bob Dole won, and then Clinton ultimately won. So we see these little subtle blips that can be affected through elections and campaigns. And then 5, the final one is public opinion, which is much more of like a feedback mechanism. And we should always, as challenging as this could be, depending on your political beliefs, embrace public feedback in all its forms, nonviolent forms, that is. In a democracy, we rely on that. Our policymakers need to have that check, that input, constantly reminding them, hey, you're not doing something right. I don't like what's on your agenda. You need to shift that. I don't like these votes or decisions you're making. I don't like the way you're implementing the laws. Change it, change it. Feedback constantly coming from the public in the form of public opinion, which is typically polled and then conveyed to policymakers, that can have an effect on any one of those boxes. And so it's funny, don't fall into this trap of being a hyper-partisan, where, oh, I really don't like these protesters who are against the Iraq war and they want to get us out and close Gitmo, and they don't like Bush, and yeah, it's just, we should not let these people protest. We don't want to hear them. Versus, well, I don't like these Tea Partiers, and they shouldn't be speaking up and telling the world what they think. They're ill-informed and they're wrong. And I mean, it's so easy to slip back into that mode. And anytime someone is out there expressing opinions that are different from yours, you just want them to shut up. But we can't think like that. We have to remember that we need all opinions, and people are free to voice them. And if you don't like what someone's saying, nothing stops you from getting out there to counteract it. That's the beauty of this system. If you don't agree with someone who's starting putting together a march or some sort of movement, you can form your own. You don't have to complain about it. That's the beauty of things. So does everyone get a pretty good understanding now of how all these actors and institutions relate to this process? And that the key things are pretty clear. No one actor or institution has all the power. Kingdon says agenda setting is the most important. You don't have to agree with that. We can have discussions and debates about that moving forward. But that everyone has a unique strength in this system. No one is in all of control. Hopefully we're already starting to see that the world is much more complicated than it's portrayed in Schoolhouse Rock, right? We're already starting to realize that just by this first and second class. It's going to get even better, I promise.